Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're turning our eyes toward the horizon.
The eastern horizon specifically.
Exactly. We are looking at a body of water that might just be the most contested, the most volatile, and maybe the most critically important stretch of ocean on the planet.
Oh, it's definitely the one keeping the most naval strategists up at night.
I can imagine.
And honestly, it should probably be keeping economists and supply chain managers awake too.
We are talking, of course, about the South China Sea. And, when I first started digging into the research for this, I thought I knew the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, China's building islands, the U.S. is sailing ships past them to make a point, and, everybody's mad.
The standard headline loop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the more I read, the more I realized that it's just the surface.
It is. It's the headline version. But the reality is so much more structural. It's geologic, it's historical, and it's deeply, deeply legal.
Which is why we're starting with this concept of the long peace in East Asia. I mean, it's been relatively quiet for decades, right?
Relatively, yeah. No major state-on-state war in the region since the late 70s.
But one of our key sources today, an article from the Washington Quarterly called Echoes of the Past, puts it in these really stark terms.
I remember this line.
It says, this peace is threatened in, and I'm quoting here, barely the blink of a geopolitical eye.
That's such a chilling phrase, isn't it? The blink of a geopolitical eye.
It really is.
It makes you realize that what we think of as stability is, well, it's much more fragile than we assume. We think of peace as this solid thing, like concrete, but maybe in this region it's more like ice.
And it sets the scene perfectly. We're talking about a 3,000-mile maritime arc, trillions of dollars in global trade passing through.
Every single year.
But the part that fascinated me is that this conflict isn't just about lines on a map. It's about water. It's about fish, and it's about history.
And validation, I think that's a key word here. We have to validate the stakes.
Yeah.
This isn't just some regional squabble between neighbors over a fence line. Andrew Scobell, in his article for Political Science Quarterly, calls it a slow-intensity conflict.
I love that term.
Me too. Because it implies something that's burning hot enough to change the facts on the ground. But slowly enough that it doesn't immediately trigger a huge war. The danger, though, as he points out, is that it could drag a major power like the United States into a real kinetic shooting war.
So that's our mission today. We're going to try and unpack that, move beyond the island-building headlines, and understand the actual doctrine behind it.
And we have a massive stack of sources to do it.
We do. We should definitely give credit where it's due because these authors did some serious heavy lifting.
Absolutely. So we're drawing heavily from Echoes of the Past by Alan DuPont and Christopher Baker from the Washington Quarterly.
Right. And then we've got People's Republic of China Assertiveness in the South China Sea by Andrew Chubb from International Security.
A really important one. Also from International Security, there's the fascinating article Cautious Bully by Qiqian Zhang.
Cautious Bully. I can't wait to dig into that one. It sounds like a total paradox.
It's a great framework, it really is. Then there's that Andrew Scobell piece I mentioned, the South China Sea and U.S.-China rivalry.
And we're also pulling from the big Congressional Research Service report, U.S.-China Strategic Competition in South and East China Seas.
And finally, we're referencing the course materials from the module on international relations in East Asia.
That is a serious syllabus.
It is. And our goal is to put all that together to understand the strategic logic. We're going to talk about a really specific doctrine that DuPont and Baker identify. Fish, protect, contest, and occupy.
And then get into the really complex legal chess match that's happening between China, its neighbors, and of course the United States.
It is a chess match.
Okay, let's start with the board and the pieces, the geography and the history. Unpack the map for us. Because when you look at a standard map and then you see what China claims, there's this massive U-shape that covers, well, almost all of it.
Right. That is the infamous 9-dash line. Sometimes you'll see it called the 10-dash or even 11-dash line, depending on the map. But in the course materials, you can see it so clearly. It just swoops down from the Chinese mainland.
It hugs the coast of Vietnam.
Loops way down past Malaysia and Brunei, almost touches Indonesia, and then swings right back up past the Philippines.
Someone described it to me once as a giant tongue licking the ocean.
That's a very vivid way to put it.
Yeah.
But it's accurate. It covers something like 90% of the South China Sea.
90%.
And what's so fascinating, and the materials really highlight this, is the origin of this line. We tend to think of it as a creation of the current communist government.
Right, from Beijing today.
But it actually originates from the Republic of China era. So the government that's now in Taiwan, back in 1947, right after World War II.
So this actually predates the People's Republic of China.
Strictly speaking, yes.
Yeah.
The 11-dash line was drawn by the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. When the communists won the Civil War in 1949, they essentially adopted that map.
But why? Why then?
Well, you have to look at the power vacuum left by World War II. Before, say, 1940, Western colonial powers, the French, the British, the U.S., they controlled most of these little islands and reefs.
Okay.
Then Japan just swept through and took all of it between 1941 and 1945.
And when Japan lost, it was a free-for-all, a scramble.
Exactly. A total power vacuum. The French were trying to get back into Indochina. The Americans were focused on rebuilding Japan. And the Chinese nationalists just looked at the map and said, these are ours now.
And in that scramble, all these overlapping claims just got locked in.
Right. And we should probably differentiate the features because it gets confusing. You've got the Paracel Islands up in the northwest.
Okay.
That dispute is mainly between the People's Republic of China and Vietnam.
Paracel's China versus Vietnam. Got it.
Then, if you go further south, you get the Spratly Islands. And this is where it gets really messy.
The messy one?
This is the messy one. You've got claims from China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei.
Everybody wants a piece of the Spratlys.
It's a complete mess of overlapping jurisdictions.
And that Congressional Research Service report really gives you a sense of scale here. I mean, we're not talking about a pond.
No.
This body of water is more than twice the size of the Mediterranean Sea.
Just try to imagine policing or controlling the entire Mediterranean from one end to the other. That's the challenge.
Yeah.
It is vast.
Well, why? Why fight over these tiny little rocks that are, barely above water at high tide? Is it just national pride?
Well, nationalism is a huge part of it, for sure. It's about legitimacy for the government. But it's also about what they call strategic commodities. Resources, but maybe not the ones you immediately think of.
Not just oil and gas.
Everyone assumes it's oil and gas. And yes, there are potentially huge hydrocarbon reserves there. Some estimates call it a second Persian Gulf.
Wow.
But DuPont and Baker, in their article Echoes of the Past, they make a really strong case that while oil gets the headlines, fish are a critical driver. Protein. I mean, you have to remember, East Asia has a massive population. China alone is 1.4 billion people.
And their own coastal waters are
depleted. They've been overfished for decades. So the search for protein is pushing these huge fishing fleets further and further away from the coast. And the waters in the Spratlys and Paracels, some of the most biodiverse and productive fishing grounds in the world.
I remember reading in that DuPont and Baker piece, they talked about this concept of blue soil.
Yes. That's such a profound concept, isn't it?
It really stuck with me, blue soil. The idea that for a nation like China, controlling the water and what's in it is just as vital as controlling farmland, the actual soil, to feed its people.
It completely reframes the conflict. It's not just about territory anymore. It's about food security.
And if you can't feed your people.
Throughout Chinese history, the inability to feed the population is what topples dynasties. So the Communist Party sees this as, an existential issue.
Which leads us directly into the strategy. Because if you see the ocean as your soil, you have to cultivate it. You have to protect it. And this brings us right to that fish, protect, contest, and occupy framework from DuPont and Baker.
The FPCO doctrine. I found this part so fascinating because it makes the chaos seem organized. It's a cycle.
The very deliberate one. Let's break it down because this really is the engine of what's happening. Step one, fish.
Right. You don't send the Navy in first. A destroyer is an act of escalation.
Too obvious.
Way too obvious. Instead, you send the fishing fleet. You actually encourage your fishermen to go into these disputed waters. You give them fuel subsidies, better navigation systems. You basically pay them to go fish in the danger zone.
And on the surface, that looks innocent enough. We're just fishermen.
Plausible deniability. That is the key. But then you get step two, protect.
Okay.
The state says, our poor fishermen are being harassed by the Vietnamese. They're being bullied in our traditional waters. We must send the China Coast Guard to protect them.
So now you have uniformed, state-owned ships in the area, but it's for a, protective mission. It's exactly. We're just here to ensure safety. But you have to understand, the China Coast Guard is not like other Coast Guards. Some of their cutters are bigger than U.S. Navy destroyers.
They're huge.
They're massive reinforced ships. And that presence leads directly to step three, contest.
Contests.
Now that your ships are there, you start challenging anyone else's claim to that water. You harass their fishing boats. You cut the seismic cables if they're looking for oil.
You start acting like the landlord.
You're the landlord. You hail other ships on the radio and say, you are in Chinese waters, depart immediately. You assert administrative control.
And then the final step?
Step 4, occupy. Once you've established dominance in the water and the other claimants are either pushed out or just too scared to come back, you build something.
Oh.
Maybe it starts as just a shelter for fishermen or a weather station, but eventually it becomes a permanent military outpost.
And this whole cycle really depends on a group that I think is one of the most interesting parts of this whole story.
Yeah.
The maritime militia, the so-called Little Blue Man. The Little Blue Man, this is absolutely crucial. We tend to focus on the People's Liberation Army Navy, the gray hulls.
Warships.
Right. But the maritime militia are essentially paramilitary forces disguised as fishermen, and they are coordinated by the state.
How do we know they're not just, regular fishermen who happen to be really patriotic?
Because of how they operate. They move in military-style formations. Their trawlers often have reinforced hulls, specifically for ramming. They have direct communication links to the military. And you'll see them just park in a disputed area for weeks without actually fishing.
They're just occupying space.
They're there to be a presence. And the sources point to a perfect historical example of this strategy in action. The 1974 seizure of the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam.
That's the textbook case, right?
It is. It didn't start with a naval bombardment. It started with fishermen. Chinese fishing boats just moved into the area and swamped the South Vietnamese defenders, overwhelmed them.
And when South Vietnam tried to push back,
Beijing claimed its citizens were under attack and sent in the military to protect them. By the time the smoke cleared, China controlled the Paracels. Yeah. And they've been refining that playbook ever since.
You mentioned the cabbage strategy earlier. That's such a great visual.
It's a term used by Chinese major generals themselves. Imagine you want to take an island. You wrap it in layers, like a cabbage.
Okay.
The inner layer, right against the island, is the fishing boats, the militia. The next layer out is the Coast Guard and fisheries enforcement ships. Then, the People's Liberation Army Navy sits on the outer ring, just over the horizon, providing the heavy muscle if things get serious.
So if you're a Filipino Marine on some tiny outpost, you just look out your window and see this wall of ships.
You are completely cut off. You can't get supplies, you can't get food. They just squeeze you until you have to leave or starve. It's a siege tactic, but at sea.
And that's related to salami slicing, isn't it?
Very much so. Taking these small, incremental steps, none of them on its own is big enough to justify going to war.
Right.
If a fishing boat shows up, do you fire a missile? Of course not. If a Coast Guard cutter arrives, do you declare war? No. But slice by slice, the reality on the ground or on the water changes. And before you know it, the whole sausage is gone.
The DuPont and Baker article points to the 1995 Mischief Reef incident as a perfect example of this.
Oh, Mischief Reef is the classic case study. It's deep inside the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. We're talking less than 150 miles from the Philippine coast and almost 1,000 kilometers from China.
1,000 kilometers.
And in 1995, the Philippines discovers these structures on the reef. And China says, oh, don't worry about those. They're just shelters for our fishermen to rest during storms.
Just harmless shelters. How neighborly.
Just harmless shelters.
Yeah.
And the Philippines complained, but, what could they really do militarily? So over the years, those shelters got upgraded, then they got concrete, then they got satellite dishes.
And today?
Today, Mischief Reef is a massive artificial island with a runway, hangars, and missile systems. That is the FPCO cycle. Fish, protect, contest, occupy.
So this brings up the big debate in the academic world. We see this behavior, and the word everyone always uses is assertive. China is being assertive. But one of our sources, Andrew Chubb, wrote this whole article basically asking, wait a minute, what does that word actually mean?
It's such a messy term. We throw it around all the time. But Chubb really challenges us to define it. Does assertive mean military aggression? Does it mean building an island? Does it just mean passing a new domestic law?
Because if you don't define it, you can't understand when it started or why.
Exactly. And the when is so important here. The common story, the one you hear on the news, is that everything changed when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012.
The strong man arrives.
Right. He's the hawk, so he must be the one driving this. But Chubb's data shows something completely different. He traces the shift back to about 2007 or 2008.
That's way before Xi took over.
Way before. So if it wasn't Xi, what was it?
And Chubb points to something a lot less dramatic, domestic bureaucracy.
Government agencies. Bureaucracies. The State Oceanic Administration, the fisheries agencies, the local provincial governments.
You're saying this came from the bottom up.
At least in part.
Yeah.
These were agencies that wanted more budget, more power. They wanted to justify their existence and expand their mission. So you have this bottom-up pressure from maritime agencies acting aggressively to prove they were doing their job, to get more funding from Beijing.
So it wasn't necessarily some grand top-down order from a villain in a volcano lair saying, seize the sea.
No.
It was mid-level bureaucrats trying to protect their budgets.
At least initially. It creates a momentum of its own. It's not just a top-down strategy. It's this complex machine with all these different gears turning. And of course, once the leadership saw the strategic value, they absolutely embraced it. But the spark might have been much more mundane.
That adds so much nuance, it makes the Chinese state seem less like a monolith. But I want to bring in another theory that I found so compelling. Qichen Zhang's cautious bully.
Yes, this is a vital piece of the puzzle.
She asked this great question. Is China a mad dog just lashing out randomly? Or is it a cautious bully?
And Zhang argues forcefully for the cautious bully model. She says Beijing is calculating. They are not irrational.
Right.
They use coercion, absolutely, but only when the cost is low and the likelihood of success is high. They're constantly doing a cost-benefit analysis.
She also talks about reactive versus proactive coercion.
This is key. We often think of China as always being on the offense, always pushing. But her research shows that a lot of China's coercive actions are actually reactive.
Meaning
They tend to lash out when a neighbor does something to change the status quo first.
like if Vietnam tries to drill for oil in a disputed area.
Exactly. Or if the Philippines tries to bring the U.S. more into the dispute.
Right.
Or if a country tries to internationalize the issue by going to the United Nations. Zhang uses the 2014 oil rig HYSY 981 standoff as a prime example.
Walk us through that one.
So, in May 2014, China parks this giant state-owned oil rig, the HYSY 981, in waters claimed by Vietnam. A huge provocation. They surround it with dozens of ships.
I remember this. There were collisions, water cannons.
Riots in Vietnam. It looked like it could be the start of a war, a massive flex of power. But here's the cautious part. They withdrew the rig a month ahead of schedule.
They pulled it back.
They did. They claimed they had finished their work, but the timing was suspicious.
Yeah.
They made their point. We can put this here anytime we want. But when the diplomatic and economic costs started to rise and Vietnam pushed back harder than maybe they expected, they pulled back.
So they calculated that the cost was getting too high.
Precisely. They push until they hit real resistance, then they reassess. They're not trying to start World War III over an oil rig. They're trying to win without fighting.
Which brings us to the most visible way they're winning without fighting. Literally changing the physical reality of the ocean. The Sand Great Wall.
This is where the engineering feat is just. It's mind-boggling. The course slides and the Congressional Research Service report really detail this. Starting around 2013, 2014, we saw this massive land reclamation campaign.
And we're not just talking about piling up a few sandbags here.
No, we're talking about these massive cutter suction dredgers. These are ships that basically lower a giant drill head to the seafloor, chew up the coral reef, and suck it up through a tube.
And then just spray it out onto the reef to create land.
To create solid land. It's environmentally catastrophic, by the way. It just annihilates the coral ecosystem. But it creates thousands of acres of land where there was once just water.
On 7 different features in the Spratlys.
Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef. They've turned them into logistics hubs with 10,000-foot runways.
10,000 feet. That's a serious runway.
That is capable of handling heavy bombers, fighter jets, large transport planes. They've built reinforced hangars, radar domes, missile batteries. These are, for all intents and purposes, unsinkable aircraft carriers parked in the middle of the world's most important trade routes.
And it's not just the military hardware, it's the administrative side that really creates these facts on the ground. I was reading about Sanchez City.
Sanchez City. This is a brilliant, if bizarre, piece of what's called lawfare, legal warfare.
What is it?
In 2012, China established a new prefecture-level city called Sancha. Its headquarters is on Woody Island in the Paracels.
A city, like with a mayor and a post office.
A mayor, a post office, a bank, a 5G network. But its official territory covers nearly 2 million square kilometers of ocean.
So they're claiming to administer empty ocean as municipal territory.
Exactly. It's an attempt to normalize the claim, to make it mundane. Oh, you're sailing through Sancha city limits. It turns an international dispute into a domestic administrative issue.
And a city can pass laws.
And a city can pass laws. The DuPont and Baker source highlights the Hainan Province regulations from 2014. They passed a law that requires foreign fishing vessels to get permission to enter the South China Sea, basically Sanche's jurisdiction, or face huge fines.
So they're applying domestic law to international waters.
And it's a legal trap. If you pay the fine, you're acknowledging their jurisdiction. If you don't, they can confiscate your boat.
It's incredibly clever, but obviously the rest of the world isn't just sitting back and watching this. Let's talk about the United States. Why does the U.S. care so much? I mean, this is halfway around the world from California. Why is this a core American interest?
Well, the Congressional Research Service report breaks this down into three main buckets. First and foremost, freedom of navigation.
The ability to sail wherever you want.
Wherever international law allows, yes. The entire global system of trade, which the U.S. Navy underwrites, relies on the principle that the oceans are a global commons. If China can just declare an entire sea its sovereign territory...
It sets a precedent.
A huge one. If they can do it there, why can't Iran do it in the Strait of Hormuz? Why can't Russia do it in the Arctic? It threatens the whole system.
Okay, so that's number one. What's two?
Number two is treaty allies. The U.S. has mutual defense treaties with the Philippines and Japan. If they get attacked, the U.S. is obligated to help defend them. So American credibility is on the line. If America lets its allies get bullied, the value of those treaties drops to zero.
And the third?
Preventing hegemony. It's been a cornerstone of U.S. policy for a century to prevent any single power from dominating East Asia to the point where they can exclude the U.S. or dictate terms to the region. The U.S. wants to maintain a balance of power.
So the U.S. is trying to hold the line. And in 2016, there was this massive legal bombshell that seemed like it might stop China cold. The arbitration ruling.
This was the Super Bowl of maritime law. The Philippines took China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague.
And what happened?
It was a blowout. I mean, the tribunal ruled overwhelmingly against China on almost every point.
In what way?
Well, two major findings. First, they ruled that the 9-dash line has absolutely no legal basis. You can't just draw a line on a map from 1947 and claim historic rights that supersedes modern international law.
So the line is legally invalid.
Correct. Second, they ruled on the status of the features themselves. They said that things like Mischief Reef are what's known as low-tide elevations.
Meaning they're underwater at high tide.
Right. And under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a rock that's underwater at high tide cannot generate territorial waters. You can't own the ocean around it.
So building an island on top of it doesn't change anything.
It doesn't give you sovereignty. It's still just a rock on the seabed with a building on it.
That seems pretty decisive.
Yeah.
How did China react?
With what they call the three no's. No acceptance, no participation, and no recognition. They called the ruling a piece of waste paper. They just completely ignored it.
Which brings us to the security dilemma that Andrew Scobell talks about.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the law doesn't work, what's left? Force.
That is the trap. The security dilemma is this classic concept in international relations. It's a spiral where actions taken by one state to increase its security make another state feel insecure.
So they increase their security.
Which makes the first state feel even more insecure, and on it goes.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. So the U.S. does a pivot to Asia to reassure its allies, moves more ships to the region. China sees this and calls it encirclement or containment. They say, the Americans are trying to choke us off.
So they build more bases on the islands to defend themselves.
And the U.S. sees the bases and says, look, they're militarizing the sea. We need to do more patrols. And this leads to the freedom of navigation operations, or FONAPs.
I think these are often misunderstood. What exactly is a FONAP?
It's a very specific legal signal. The U.S. Navy will sail a warship, usually a destroyer, within 12 nautical miles of a Chinese claimed island.
Why 12 miles?
Because 12 nautical miles is the limit of territorial waters under international law. If a feature is a true island, it owns the water out to 12 miles. By sailing inside that limit without asking for permission, the U.S. is physically demonstrating, we do not recognize this as your territory. This is international water.
And China, of course, hates this.
They see it as a profound violation of their sovereignty. They see a U.S. warship entering what they consider their territorial waters. They shadow the U.S. ship. They shout warnings over the radio. And sometimes they get dangerously close.
And that gets us to the risks, the flashpoint. Where does this go wrong? We're not necessarily talking about a planned invasion, are we?
No, I don't think so.
No.
The most likely spark isn't some D-Day style landing. It's an accident. It's a collision. Scobell highlights the 2014 Second Thomas Shoal incident as a terrifying near miss.
This is the one with the Philippine supply ship, right? The shipwreck.
The shipwreck, yeah. It's a bizarre story. The Philippines took this old World War II-era ship, the Sierra Madre, and intentionally ran it aground on this shoal.
And a handful of Marines live on it.
A handful of Marines live on this rusting hulk to mark their claim. It's incredible. But they need food and water, so the Philippines tries to send these little supply boats. And in 2014, a much larger Chinese Coast Guard cutter tried to block one.
They played chicken.
The game of chicken on the open ocean. And at the time, there were U.S. aircraft buzzing overhead. And you just have to think, if that Chinese cutter had rammed the Philippine boat, if it had sunk, if those Marines had died.
The U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty could have been triggered.
And you go from a supply run to a potential war between nuclear powers in an afternoon.
That margin of error is terrifyingly thin. And you mentioned earlier there's a deeper structural shift happening too, something about a strategist named Mahan.
Alfred Thayer Mahan, a 19th century American naval strategist. His books are required reading at the U.S. Naval War College, but guess who else is reading them very closely? The People's Liberation Army Navy.
What was his big idea?
Basically, that sea power is the key to national greatness. Mahan argued that to be a true great power, you can't just be a continental power, a land army. You have to be a maritime power. You need a blue water navy that can project power far from your shores to protect your trade.
And China has historically been a land power.
For thousands of years, they worried about invaders from the north, the Mongols, the Manchus. They built the Great Wall to protect the land. But now, their entire economy depends on global trade. They import oil, they export goods. They need the sea.
So they're shifting their entire strategic identity.
From land to sea. And that makes this conflict structural. It's not just about a few rocks. It's about China's fundamental evolution into a global superpower.
So we've covered the map, the doctrine, the history, the risks. Let's try to summarize this deep dive.
If we boil it all down, you have a rising power. China, using this very clever integrated strategy. Fish, protect, contest, occupy.
Right. And using the maritime militia civilians as a shield to complicate any response.
Then you have the theory of the cautious bully. They're calculating. They're pushing just hard enough to change the reality, but they're pulling back before it starts a major war.
And on the other side, you have the United States trying to maintain the post-World War II order, relying on international law and freedom of navigation.
But getting caught in a security dilemma where every move they make to stabilize the region just seems to escalate the tension.
So for the person listening to this, trying to understand the world, so what? Why does this matter to them?
Well, on a very practical level, it matters because the South China Sea is the throat of the global economy. Trillions of dollars in trade. If that waterway closes, or if it becomes the private lake of one nation, the global supply chain breaks.
Your iPhone, your car parts.
Your energy, it all floats through there. But on a deeper level, this is the primary testing ground for the 21st century. It's a test of whether the world's going to be governed by rules, by international law, by arbitration, by treaties, or if we're going back to might makes right.
Because if a big country can just rewrite the map because they have a bigger navy,
then the last 70 years of international order are effectively over.
That is a heavy thought. And I want to leave our listeners with one final provocative question based on all these readings.
Okay.
We talked about the law. We talked about the 2016 ruling that said very clearly, China, you can't do this. And China basically said, watch us. So here's the question. If China continues to build these facts on the ground, if they build the islands and the cities and the runways and the world protests and the courts rule against them, but nobody physically stops them, does the law actually matter?
That is the ultimate question of geopolitics, isn't it? Possession is 9/10 of the law.
Especially when you've got a runway and a missile battery on the possession.
Exactly. Has the map already been redrawn while we were all busy debating the legal text?
Something to think about next time you look at a map of Asia. And definitely check the show notes. We've linked that map of the 9-dash line. You really need to see the scale for yourself to believe it. This was fantastic.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next deep dive.